Sarah Martinez had been working at Pine Valley Shooting Range for 3 months, and in all that time, she had perfected the art of being invisible. Every morning at 6 sharp, she would arrive through the back entrance, slip on her worn work gloves, and begin her routine of sweeping spent brass casings from the shooting lanes. The metallic clinks of the casings hitting her collection bucket had become a familiar soundtrack to her days. She moved methodically from lane 1 to lane 24, her head down, eyes focused on the concrete floor beneath her feet. The other employees barely noticed her presence, and that was exactly how she preferred it. Sarah was 22 years old, but life had aged her beyond her years. 3 years ago, her father had been killed in a workplace accident at the construction site where he had worked for 15 years. The insurance settlement barely covered the funeral costs, leaving Sarah and her younger brother Miguel to fend for themselves. Miguel was still in high school, and Sarah had dropped out of community college to work full-time and keep their small apartment. Before Pine Valley, she had worked at a diner, a grocery store, and a laundromat. Each job had been the same story: long hours, minimum wage, and the constant worry that she wasn't doing enough to provide for Miguel. When she saw the job posting for range maintenance at Pine Valley, she didn't even know what a shooting range looked like inside. But it paid $2 more per hour than her previous job, and that extra money meant Miguel could stay on the school lunch program. The range was owned by Frank Morrison, a former military man who had built the facility from the ground up 20 years ago. Frank was respected in the community, known for running safety courses for local law enforcement and hosting competitive shooting events. He had a reputation for being tough, but fair, though Sarah had barely exchanged 10 words with him since starting work. Most of her interactions were with Janet, the office manager, who handed her the weekly schedule and reminded her about safety protocols. The range instructors, mostly retired police officers and military veterans, would nod politely when they passed her in the hallways, but they were usually too busy with their students to pay much attention to the quiet young woman who cleaned up after their sessions. Sarah's routine was simple and predictable. She would sweep the lanes, empty the trash bins, clean the windows of the shooting booths, and sanitize the surfaces. During busy periods, she would wait in the small break room until the firing stopped, then quickly sweep between sessions. She had learned to time her work perfectly, knowing exactly how long each task would take and when the range would be clear. The work itself didn't bother her. In fact, she found something almost meditative about the repetitive motions of sweeping and cleaning. It gave her time to think, to plan, and sometimes to remember better times when her father was alive, and the future seemed full of possibilities. She would think about the nursing program she had been enrolled in, the books still sitting unopened in her bedroom, and the dream she had put on hold. What made the job challenging wasn't the physical labor. It was the constant reminder of her circumstances. Many of the range's customers were successful professionals, law enforcement officers, and enthusiasts who could afford expensive firearms and equipment. They drove nice cars and wore clothes that cost more than Sarah made in a week. She didn't resent them, but their presence was a stark reminder of the gap between her reality and the life she had once imagined for herself. Miguel knew about her job, but not about how much she struggled to make ends meet. She told him she was taking a gap year to save money for college, and she made sure he never went without the things he needed for school. On Friday afternoons, when he would excitedly tell her about his classes or his friends, she would smile and encourage him, never letting on that she sometimes went to bed hungry so he could have lunch money for the next week. The other employees at Pine Valley were kind enough, but Sarah kept to herself. During lunch breaks, she would sit in her old Honda in the parking lot, eating a peanut butter sandwich and calling Miguel to check on his day. She avoided the employee break room, where conversations often turned to weekend plans, vacations, or purchases she couldn't afford. It was easier to remain apart than to constantly be reminded of what she was missing. On this particular Tuesday morning, Sarah arrived to find the range busier than usual. A group of new police recruits were scheduled for training, which meant the lanes would be in heavy use throughout the day. She would have to be extra efficient with her cleaning, working quickly between sessions to keep the facility in top condition. As she began her routine in Lane 1, she could hear Frank Morrison in the main office discussing the training schedule with Sergeant Collins, who ran the police academy programs. Their voices carried across the range as they reviewed safety protocols and discussed the performance standards the recruits would need to meet. Sarah worked steadily, her movements practiced and efficient. She had learned to read the rhythm of the range, to anticipate when sessions would end and when she would have her brief windows to clean. The spent casings told their own story. She could identify different calibers by sight and sound, and she had even learned to estimate how many rounds had been fired just by looking at the brass scattered across the floor. As the morning progressed, the range filled with the sounds of instruction and gunfire. Sarah continued her work, moving from lane to lane with quiet determination. She had no way of knowing that her careful attention to detail and quiet efficiency had not gone completely unnoticed, or that this day would mark the beginning of a change in her carefully ordered world. The first sign that something was different came when Frank Morrison walked past her during one of the training breaks. Instead of his usual brief nod, he stopped and watched her work for a moment. Sarah felt his eyes on her, but kept her head down, focusing on collecting the brass casings with the same methodical care she always used. "Good work," he said simply, then continued on his way. It was the first time he had spoken directly to her about her performance, and Sarah felt a small flutter of pride despite herself. She had always taken care to do her job well, but recognition was something she hadn't expected. She finished cleaning the lane and moved on to the next one, unaware that Frank Morrison was beginning to see something in her quiet dedication that others had overlooked. As the day continued, Sarah maintained her routine, but something had shifted. For the first time since starting at Pine Valley, she felt truly seen by someone who mattered. It was a small moment, barely lasting a few seconds, but it planted a seed of possibility that would soon begin to grow in ways she never could have imagined. The next morning, Sarah arrived at Pine Valley to find Frank Morrison waiting for her in the equipment room. He was examining a damaged target retrieval system, his weathered hands tracing the frayed cable that had snapped during yesterday's training session. "Sarah," he said without looking up, "how long have you been working here?" "3 months, sir," she replied, setting down her cleaning supplies and wondering if she was in trouble. "You know this equipment better than most people realize," he continued, finally turning to face her. "I've watched you work around it, seen how careful you are. Have you ever looked at how these systems operate?" Sarah was surprised by the question. She had indeed observed the target mechanisms during her cleaning, noticed when they ran smoothly and when they struggled. She had even figured out that certain lanes had consistent problems with their retrieval systems. "A little," she admitted. "Lane 15's motor sounds different from the others, and Lane 8 sometimes gets jammed when the targets are pulled back too quickly." Frank raised an eyebrow. Most people who work with these systems every day don't notice those details. "Where did you learn about mechanical systems?" "My father," Sarah said quietly. "He was a supervisor at Morrison Construction. No relation to you. He used to bring me to work sometimes during school breaks. He taught me to pay attention to how machines sound when they're working properly versus when something's wrong." Frank nodded slowly. "Morrison Construction. Good company. I knew Tom Morrison before he sold the business." "What happened to your father?" Sarah's throat tightened, but she answered honestly. "Accident on a job site 3 years ago. Equipment failure." The range owner was quiet for a moment, studying her face. "I'm sorry for your loss. That explains a lot about how you approach your work here. You understand safety and attention to detail in a way that can't be taught." Over the following weeks, Frank began giving Sarah small additional responsibilities. He showed her how to properly maintain the target systems, taught her to identify signs of wear in the equipment, and explained the importance of preventive maintenance. Sarah absorbed everything eagerly, grateful for work that engaged her mind as well as her hands. She discovered she had a natural aptitude for understanding mechanical systems. The target retrieval mechanisms, ventilation systems, and Even the electronic timing equipment all made sense to her in ways that reminded her of working alongside her father. For the first time since his death, she felt connected to the skills he had taught her. Frank also began assigning her to work during special events and training sessions where her attention to safety and detail could be put to better use. During a weekend law enforcement competition, he had her assist with equipment setup and target management. Sarah worked efficiently and quietly, but Frank noticed how she anticipated problems before they occurred and solved small issues without being asked. "You have good instincts," he told her after the event. "Have you ever considered range safety officer training?" Sarah looked up from the equipment she was securing. "I don't know anything about firearms, Mr. Morrison. I've never even held one." "That's not necessarily a disadvantage," Frank replied. "Some of the best safety officers I know started with mechanical and procedural knowledge rather than shooting experience. The firearms knowledge can be taught. The safety mindset and attention to detail you already have." The idea intrigued Sarah, but she worried about the cost of training and certification. When she hesitantly mentioned this concern, Frank surprised her with an offer. "The range needs qualified safety officers for our expanded training programs. If you're interested, I'll cover the cost of your certification training in exchange for a commitment to work here for at least 2 years after you're certified. The position comes with a significant pay increase." Sarah's heart raced. The pay increase would mean she could afford to help Miguel with college applications and maybe even take a few community college courses herself. But she was also terrified of the responsibility and unsure if she was really capable of learning what was required. "Can I think about it?" she asked. "Of course, but don't think too long. The next certification course starts in 6 weeks." That evening, Sarah sat at her small kitchen table with Miguel, helping him with his calculus homework while she wrestled with Frank's offer. Miguel had been accepted to the state university and was planning to study engineering, following in their father's footsteps, but in a different direction. The scholarship he had received would cover most of his tuition, but there would still be expenses for books, housing, and living costs. "You've been different lately," Miguel observed as he worked through a particularly challenging problem. "Happier, maybe. Things going better at work." Sarah realized he was right. Despite her fears about the new opportunity, she had felt more engaged and hopeful in recent weeks than she had since their father's death. The work Frank was giving her felt meaningful, and she was learning skills that genuinely interested her. "My boss offered me a chance to train for a promotion," she said carefully. "It would mean better pay and more responsibility." Miguel looked up from his homework with excitement. "That's amazing, Sarah. You should definitely do it. It's scary, though. It's completely different from what I'm doing now, and I'd have to learn a lot of new things. Dad always said that scary opportunities are usually the ones worth taking," Miguel reminded her. "Remember how he used to tell us that being comfortable was the enemy of growing?" Sarah smiled, remembering their father's words. He had often talked about pushing beyond comfort zones and taking calculated risks. She realized that accepting Frank's offer would be exactly the kind of decision he would have encouraged her to make. The next morning, she found Frank in his office reviewing training schedules. "I want to do the certification training," she announced before she could lose her nerve. Frank looked up with approval. "Good. I was hoping you'd say that. We'll start preparing you immediately. The written exam covers firearms safety, range procedures, legal responsibilities, and emergency response. The practical exam will test your ability to manage live fire exercises and handle various emergency scenarios." Over the next 6 weeks, Sarah threw herself into studying with an intensity she hadn't felt since high school. Frank provided her with study materials and arranged for the range's senior instructors to teach her about firearms operation and safety. She studied every evening after work, often late into the night, determined not to waste the opportunity Frank was giving her. The learning curve was steep. She had to master not only the technical aspects of different firearms and ammunition types, but also the complex web of local and federal regulations governing shooting ranges. She learned about ballistics, proper stance, and breathing techniques, and how to identify and correct common shooting errors in students. More challenging than the technical knowledge was overcoming her nervousness around firearms themselves. Her first day of hands-on training was terrifying. Standing in lane 1 with veteran instructor Dave Rodriguez, Sarah held a basic .22 caliber pistol with shaking hands. "It's normal to be nervous," Dave assured her. "Respect for the weapon is a good thing. But you need to be confident and calm when you're supervising others." Through patient instruction and gradual exposure, Sarah began to develop competence and even a measure of confidence with firearms. She discovered that her mechanical aptitude served her well in understanding how different weapons operated, and her natural caution made her excellent at spotting safety violations before they became dangerous. 3 weeks before the certification exam, Frank began having Sarah shadow experienced safety officers during live training sessions. She watched them manage everything from basic marksmanship classes to advanced tactical training, learning how to read body language, anticipate problems, and maintain control of potentially dangerous situations. During one particularly busy Saturday session, an experienced shooter in lane 12 began showing signs of fatigue and frustration, his shots becoming increasingly erratic. Sarah noticed the problem before the supervising instructor did and quietly alerted him to the situation. The instructor was able to intervene before the shooter made a serious safety error. "Good catch," the instructor told her afterward. "That kind of awareness will make you an excellent safety officer." As the certification date approached, Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and terror. She had thrown herself completely into the preparation, and Frank and the other instructors seemed confident in her abilities. But she also understood the weight of responsibility that would come with certification. People's safety would depend on her knowledge, judgment, and quick reactions. The night before the exam, she called Miguel to hear his voice and draw strength from his confidence in her abilities. "You've got this, Sarah," he assured her. "You've worked harder for this than anything I've ever seen you do. And besides, Mr. Morrison wouldn't have recommended you if he didn't believe you could succeed." As Sarah hung up the phone and reviewed her study materials one last time, she realized that regardless of what happened during the exam, she had already accomplished something important. For the first time since their father's death, she was actively building toward a future instead of just surviving day by day. Tomorrow would determine whether that future would unfold at Pine Valley or somewhere else. But either way, she had proven to herself that she was capable of more than she had ever imagined. The certification exam took place on a crisp October morning at the State Law Enforcement Training Facility, 2 hours' drive from Pine Valley. Sarah arrived early, her stomach churning with nervousness, but her mind clear and focused. She had studied every manual, practiced every procedure, and spent countless hours at the range preparing for this moment. The written portion of the exam covered everything from federal firearms regulations to emergency medical response procedures. Sarah worked through each question methodically, drawing on the intensive preparation Frank and his team had provided. When she finished, she felt cautiously optimistic about her performance, but the practical exam still lay ahead. For the practical portion, Sarah was assigned to supervise a simulated training session with volunteer shooters of varying skill levels. Her task was to ensure safety while providing appropriate instruction and guidance. The exam proctors would be watching for her ability to identify and correct safety violations, manage the firing line effectively, and respond appropriately to various scenarios they had planned. As the mock session began, Sarah felt her training take over. She positioned herself where she could observe all shooters while maintaining clear communication with each lane. When one volunteer began to turn away from the targets while still holding his firearm, Sarah immediately called "Cease fire" in a clear, authoritative voice that surprised even her. Weapon down, pointing downrange, she instructed firmly but calmly. "Never turn away from the targets while holding your firearm." The volunteer complied immediately, and Sarah felt a surge of confidence. She continued through the session, correcting stance problems, identifying equipment issues, and maintaining strict safety protocols. When one of the exam scenarios called for her to respond to a simulated medical emergency, she followed proper procedures for securing all weapons and calling for medical assistance while providing basic first aid. At the end of the practical exam, the chief proctor approached her with a neutral expression that gave nothing away. "You'll receive your results within 10 business days," he said formally. Then, dropping his official tone slightly, he added, "Good work out there. Your safety awareness is exceptional." The drive back to Pine Valley felt endless. Sarah tried not to speculate about her performance, but she couldn't help replaying every moment of the exam in her mind. Frank had given her the day off, so she spent the afternoon helping Miguel with his college application essays, grateful for the distraction. 8 days later, the envelope arrived. Sarah stared at it for several minutes before finding the courage to open it. Inside was her official certification as a range safety officer, along with a letter noting her high scores on both portions of the exam. When she arrived at Pine Valley the next morning, Frank was waiting for her with a smile. "Congratulations, Range Safety Officer Martinez," he said, extending his hand. "I knew you could do it." Sarah's new role came with significantly more responsibility and a 40% increase in her salary. She was assigned to supervise basic firearms classes, assist with law enforcement training, and manage safety protocols during competitive events. The work was challenging and demanding, but she found herself thriving in ways she had never expected. Her first few weeks in the new position were intense learning experiences. She worked closely with experienced instructors, gradually taking on more responsibility as her confidence grew. Her natural attention to detail and mechanical aptitudes served her well, and she quickly earned the respect of both colleagues and students. One of her early challenges came during a basic firearms course for new gun owners. One student, a middle-aged businessman named Mr. Patterson, seemed to struggle with basic safety concepts and grew increasingly frustrated with his poor accuracy. During a break, Sarah approached him with patience and understanding. "I can see you're getting frustrated," she said gently. "Would you like me to help you with your stance and grip?" "I don't know why I'm so bad at this," Mr. Patterson replied, clearly embarrassed. "I bought this gun for home protection, but I can't hit anything." Sarah worked with him patiently, breaking down each element of proper shooting technique into manageable steps. She had discovered that she had a gift for instruction, able to identify specific problems and explain solutions in clear, encouraging terms. By the end of the session, Mr. Patterson was hitting the target consistently and had regained his confidence. "Thank you," he said as he packed up his equipment. "You're a natural teacher." Similar scenes played out regularly in Sarah's new role. She found particular satisfaction in working with nervous new shooters, helping them overcome their fears and develop safe, responsible habits. Her own experience of starting as a complete beginner gave her empathy and insight that proved valuable in instruction. As autumn turned to winter, Sarah's reputation at Pine Valley continued to grow. Frank began assigning her to more advanced training sessions, and law enforcement agencies specifically requested her assistance for their programs. She had developed an expertise in identifying and correcting safety violations before they became dangerous, a skill that was particularly valuable during high-stress tactical training exercises. One snowy December morning, Frank called Sarah into his office for what she assumed would be a routine scheduling meeting. Instead, she found him reviewing financial reports and training statistics. "Sit down, Sarah," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "I want to discuss something important with you." Sarah felt a familiar flutter of nervousness, wondering if she had made some error or oversight. "The Range's training programs have grown significantly this year," Frank continued. "Law enforcement agencies are booking more sessions. We're running twice as many civilian classes, and our competition events are attracting participants from 3 states. A lot of that growth is directly related to the quality of instruction and safety management we're providing." He paused, studying Sarah's face. "I'm considering expanding our training operations, possibly opening a second location. But That would require someone with exceptional skills to manage safety operations across multiple facilities. Sarah's heart began to race as she realized where the conversation was heading. "I'd like you to consider taking on the role of Chief Safety Officer," Frank said. "It would involve overseeing all safety operations, training new safety officers, developing improved protocols, and helping manage the expansion. The position comes with a substantial salary increase and opportunities for additional certifications and training." Sarah stared at him in disbelief. 6 months ago, she had been sweeping brass casings and wondering how she would pay next month's rent. Now Frank was offering her a leadership position with real responsibility and growth potential. "I don't know what to say," she managed finally. "Say you'll think about it," Frank replied with a smile. "But I hope you'll say yes. You've proven yourself to be exactly the kind of person I want representing this range." That evening, Sarah called Miguel with the news. He was home for winter break from his first semester at the state university, where he was thriving in his engineering program thanks in part to the financial stability Sarah's new job had provided. "Chief Safety Officer Sarah Martinez," he said with pride in his voice. "Dad'll be so proud of you." "I keep thinking about what he used to say about opportunities," Sarah replied. "How they usually come disguised as hard work and challenge. And about how the best way to honor people we've lost is to become the best version of ourselves we can be," Miguel added. As Sarah considered Frank's offer, she realized how much had changed since that first day when she had simply been trying to remain invisible. She had discovered capabilities she never knew she possessed, developed skills that genuinely excited her, and found work that felt meaningful rather than just necessary. The scared young woman who had kept her head down while sweeping the range had evolved into a confident professional who could manage complex safety operations and teach others to succeed. She had not only survived the tragedy that had derailed her original plans, but had found a new path that was in many ways more fulfilling than anything she had previously imagined. More importantly, she had learned that being noticed, rather than remaining invisible, could lead to opportunities she never would have discovered on her own. Frank Morrison's decision to pay attention to her quiet competence had changed the trajectory of her life, proving that sometimes the most significant transformations begin with the smallest moments of recognition. 3 days later, Sarah accepted the position of Chief Safety Officer. As she sat in Frank's office, signing the paperwork for her promotion, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From sweeping spent casings to overseeing safety operations for an expanding business, her path had been unexpected, but ultimately rewarding. Her father had taught her that honest work, attention to detail, and willingness to learn could open doors she never knew existed. Frank Morrison had provided the opportunity, but Sarah had done the hard work of seizing it and proving herself worthy of the trust placed in her. Now, as she looked toward the future, Sarah saw possibilities rather than just challenges. She would help train the next generation of safety officers, contribute to the growth of Pine Valley's training programs, and continue developing her own skills and expertise. Most importantly, she had become someone Miguel could be proud of, someone their father would have admired. The young woman who had once believed she was invisible had learned that sometimes the most powerful transformations happen when we finally allow ourselves to be seen. Frank Morrison had noticed her dedication and potential, but ultimately it was Sarah's willingness to step into the spotlight and embrace new challenges that had made all the difference. As she walked out of Frank's office and toward her bright future, Sarah smiled, knowing that she would never again underestimate the power of keeping her head up and allowing others to see what she was truly capable of achieving.